Okay, so we all know about the situation in Flint, Michigan, right? You think it's over? Well, it's not. Flint residents are now suffering from a shigellosis outbreak, and typically spreads when people don't wash their hands. But the residents of Flint can't wash their hands because, well, the water's still dirty. This whole thing started with a Michigan law that resulted in the lead poisoning of water in Flint, Michigan. The law is known as Public Act 436. Public Act 436 allows the state to replace locally elected mayors, city and town councils, and school board officials in so-called financially distressed municipalities and school districts with unelected emergency managers. But is this legal? Civil rights attorneys say that it's not, for three main reasons. First, because the law violates federal constitutional rights to due process of law. Second, because it discriminates on the basis of income by depriving residents of financially struggling cities and towns throughout Michigan of the right to vote to elect the officials that govern them. And third, because the law is applied in a racially discriminatory manner that overwhelmingly targets minority black communities and thus violates both the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution and Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But what do you think? Join us on October 18th at 5 p.m. for the first showing of College of Law Live at the Florida A&M University College of Law, where we will be joined by environmental, civil rights, and ACLU attorneys to discuss this important legal issue. And will also be available in audio podcasts on collegeoflawlive.com. Presented by the Florida A&M University College of Law Environmental Law Society. And thank you very much, and welcome to our first showing of College of Law Live. The purpose of this is to gain more notoriety to this school and to show what the school has to offer as far as legal intellect. So I do want to go down and have every one of our distinguished panelists introduce themselves so we can all get more familiar with them.
Hi, I am Josephine Balzac, and I am a very proud alum of the FAMU College of Law. Actually, on my Facebook feed today, it popped up my memory that 6 years ago, I turned in my application to graduate. So I'm very honored to be back here today talking about environmental justice issues. I also went on and got my International Environmental LLM afterwards. I'm a professor at Rollins College. I have one of my former students here who's actually applying to law school. And I also have my own law firm where I do mostly environmental regulatory. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Georgiana Holmes. Did not graduate from Florida A&M College of Law. However, I am a graduate of the Florida A&M University in Tallahassee, Florida. Thank you. After graduating from undergrad, I took a job with the Florida Environmental Equity and Justice Commission. It was a legislative body put together by then Governor Lawton Chiles to study the disproportionate impact of environmental and toxic hazards to communities of color and low-income communities. Traveling around with those folks, they gave me the idea to go to law school. I did. Upon graduating from Florida State, I then took a job with the Department of Environmental Protection, where I was in the litigation section for about 5 years, and then another 5 years in the program section, doing all things associated with solid and hazardous waste enforcement, litigation, citing, permit, legislative rulemaking. And then about 5 years ago, I came to Orange County. I'm currently in the land use section practicing land use, comprehensive plan law, and environmental law.
Hi, good evening. My name is Chardo Richardson. I'm the president of the Central Chapter ACLU of Florida. So we're responsible for Lake, Osceola, Orange County, as well as Seminole County. Myself, I 12-year veteran of the United States Air Force. Got out of the Air Force and went straight to law school in Jacksonville. Unfortunately, I didn't get to go to FAMU, and then shortly thereafter came to Orlando and took over as president of the ACLU.
Hello, I'm Pat Broussard. I'm a professor here at Florida A&M University College of Law. I'm a graduate of Northwestern University Undergraduate School, Howard University School of Law. Taught at Howard for 7 years. I've taught here for 11 years. I teach Constitutional Law 1, Constitutional Law 2, First Amendment, Women and the Law, and occasionally Advanced Appellate Advocacy.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Brandon Price Crum. I'm currently a 2L here at FAMU College of Law. I want to thank the good people at the ELS and those of you who are on the panel. It is a blessing to be amongst you all. I'm from Flint, and I was a resident of Flint, and I just want to give a perspective for you all to be able to understand what the people are going through on a day-to-day basis. Thank you.
All right, one round of applause, please. Okay, so we'll go through a quick introduction of the situation and the issue, and I'm going to get through that as quickly as possible because I want to give the floor right back to our panelists. But just so everyone can understand what's going on with the situation in Flint, let's imagine that when we all vote for president in November, it doesn't matter if it's Donald Trump or Clinton. Imagine if you vote for your candidate gets elected, but then the government says, we don't think your candidate can handle the situation, and they appoint somebody else. So that's kind of what happened in Flint, Michigan. There's a law in Michigan called Public Act 436. To make it easy, we'll just call it the Michigan law. And it allows the Michigan governor to declare a financial emergency. So if the governor declares a financial emergency, then he can say, well, any legislators in that community where I just declared this financial emergency, I'm going to have an emergency manager take over all control over that area. And historically, that has only been done in areas that are socially, economically disadvantaged and with mainly with low income and minorities. And so this Public Act 436 came into play, and the emergency managers decided to try to save some money in the city of Flint and decided to switch their water source from Lake Huron, one of the Great Lakes, and switched it over to the Flint River. And then people started to notice that their water was tasting funny, that it was harder, it wasn't as soft, it had a funny odor to it, or it turns out that the Flint water had bacteria in it, E. coli, other bacteria. Even General Motors chose not to use that water because it corroded their machines. But yet still people in their homes were still using that water. And this picture here is a picture of 2 nails that were submitted in water. The top was submitted from clean water. The top one was emitted in water that was contaminated going into people's homes. So after a month, this is what turned out. And so water was coming out of people's faucets after it eroded the pipes, and that's what you have to drink out of, and that's what you had to bathe and do things like that. And a quick explanation of how water quality is tested. This depicts a glass of water. 5 parts per billion is considered a cause for concern. So let's just say, to make it simple, you see 5 little lead particles in this glass of water. So 5 parts per billion is an issue. Well, in Virginia, in a test from Virginia Tech, the college, tested some waters in homes in Flint, Michigan, and it came out to 158 parts per billion in the water. But that wasn't the highest. There were some homes that were tested. Can anyone guess how many parts per billion were found in some homes? Anyone want to care to take a guess?
300?
Anyone? Professor Brown? 1,000? Anyone else? 2,000? Well, let's stop there because I guarantee no one will get it. If 5 parts per billion is a problem or cause for concern, how about 13,000? How about 13,000 parts per billion? So it's basically toxic waste that's coming from people's homes. And this is a quote from the Michigan Department of Environmental Protection. After these studies came out, it said, one of their representatives said, "Let me start here. Anyone who was concerned about the lead in drinking water in Flint can relax." Well, the ACLU did their own study and found that Michigan DEQ basically removed some of these detrimental studies from their documents because it would have gotten to the federal government and it would have been under federal control. So they knew about the situation. They removed it from some of the documents. So where does the law come into play here? Well, you have equal protection issues, you have due process, you have voting rights, and some of the city officials in Flint are under criminal investigations as well. But as of right now, we're concerned with the first three, and that's why these panelists are here today to give us more information about that. So Josie Balzac, would you please just, where do you want to start and just kind of explain either one of these situations and how we should be concerned about this?
Well, I think the main issue that I see in my area of expertise would be the environmental injustice or environmental racism, really, that's occurring here, and not just in Flint, but in communities of color and in low-income communities. The truth is that when you have affluent, predominantly white neighborhoods, you don't see the same type of facility sightings or environmental decision-making that you do in communities of color and in low-income communities. And clearly here, I think getting away from the tangled web of legalities and all of the violations that happened here, the lack of trust in government, and really the fact that we're getting to a point and just escalating that where we are putting monetary interest over the rights of the people, over human rights, and over the protecting the public health and safety of communities. And the fact that we have basically a law that allows a form of tyranny to occur in these communities where it completely usurps the power of the voters who elected these officials and our very system of democracy that this country was founded on, beginning with we the people, and how they no longer have a voice and a right to have the people make a decision who they elected to be in that body to begin with, is really where I would start this whole entire conversation.
And Georgiana, please, I guess your initial reaction with
Well,
this?
first, let me make a disclaimer. I work for Orange County. However, I'm not here representing Orange County government. I'm here representing myself. But I do have 20 years in the EJ movement, and like I said, a significant portion of that at DEP, and now with the county. And to echo kind of what you're saying, it's a complex problem, and I think that when you have situations like Flint that are egregious and public, and you get audible gasps with the decisions that are made, then it's a crisis. Things are in crisis. But it's incremental decisions along the way that lead to the crisis. And I think that, especially as people of color, we should engage and try and understand the incremental decisions that lead ultimately to the crisis. And so my expertise is having been inside the agencies. And so understanding that in Michigan, I'm not from Michigan, I didn't practice in Michigan, but I can speak about Florida. And so you're right, there was a law that you had elected officials and then an appointment of an emergency manager. They put conditions on, financial communities. Well, they made a declaration that the municipalities were financially struggling and therefore they needed an emergency manager. It seems like those two things are very directly related. You have a community that's low income, therefore you have a government that's low income, but they're not always together. You can have affluent communities that have struggling governments and vice versa. And so from the regulatory perspective, you're trying to protect the weakest citizens, but the tools in your toolbox are what the legislature gives you. And just here in Florida, you know, we have a governor who appoints a cabinet, who appoints the Department of Environmental Protection secretary, who then sets policy. And secretary's not an appointed official. And I can tell you, getting an appointment with him is not easy. If you're Big Sugar, you can get one. On the flip side, now I'm in county government, and getting a meeting with your local county commissioner is significantly easier. And the decisions that impact your daily, you know, your daily lives, when you're driving home, when you're driving to school, when you're driving to church, when you're taking your children to the park, when you're turning on your faucet, a lot of times those decisions are coming from your local officials. And understanding the relationship between the tools that are in the toolbox in order to protect communities of color, but understanding that the crisis situations that we all react to were incremental decisions that occurred along the way. You know, policies set by a secretary who's not elected. Water management districts, their board are governor appointees. So you vote for the governor, you don't vote for the makeup of the board of the water management districts. And there's, you know, if you're in this arena of practice, you see that there's a lot of attention that's been paid lately to chairs and board commissioners for the water management districts that are developers. Spaces that are designated for community reps, environmental justice voices. There is no appointee by the governor. Those chairs sit empty. And so I think for communities of color, if we understand all of the incremental decisions that lead to the crisis, it can make our participation very effective in getting change and keeping crises like Flint from occurring in the first place.
So basically, what's happened here, in my opinion, is the rights of a few have been pushed aside for finances, because that's what happened here. I mean, Flint, Michigan is the 8th poorest city in Michigan. So there's 7 others in Michigan that are just as poor. So for them to declare a financial emergency, and the way they switched the water from one body of water to another body of water, and then not treating the water, knowing that there's lead already in the pipes, and not caring about those people in Flint, Michigan. They basically said, we care about the finances of Michigan more than we care about the people of Flint. And that's the way I see it. Now, the rights that have been violated here are enormous. The right to vote, that's a very important right. Right here in Florida right now, we are doing our best to restore rights to disenfranchised individuals. So they've taken this political and elected offices, and then they say, you know, well, in case of an emergency, though, this person's going to handle everything. And they're not even going to have to answer to the people that you elected. And that's a problem. Now, we understand that wealth has never been considered a suspect class, right, for equal protection purposes. But at some point, we have to get to a point where we stop infringing on the rights of those that don't have as much as others. That's how I see it.
Good afternoon. As I said, I teach constitutional law, and every now and then we come to a case, and the case doesn't turn out as you would think the case would turn out. And, you know, we go through, well, why didn't the case turn out? What did it turn on? And we finally reached the conclusion that it was dumb lawyering, that the lawyers didn't know what they were doing. And I think that what's going on in Flint is complex. But I think you can work around it. I think that there are some valid arguments that can be made. But in order to understand the valid arguments and in order to make them, you have to understand what the other side is going to say. Now, one of the things the other side is going to say is they're going to agree with you, Josie. They're going to say it's a democracy. But it's a representative democracy. And a representative democracy means you elect people, and you elect those people because you made you participated in the initial election. You have agreed to go along with some of the things that those people do. I'll give you an example. There are still jurisdictions in the country that have appointed school boards. There's still jurisdictions in the country that have appointed commissions and boards. So that's the argument you're going to get. As a matter of fact, just recently, I think in the last 2 weeks, the federal court upheld the emergency management manager law. But there are other ways to get around it. But you have to have the will, because I believe that there is an equal protection argument that circumvents the rational basis for poverty. I believe there is a due process argument that you can make with respect to the Emergency Managers Act, with respect to the actions taken by that board, and with respect to the Voting Rights Act. I think that there are ways to get around it. And the last thing I want to say, it was so interesting. This summer, I was in Turkey, and I was walking down the street. I was really hot, tired, and bothered, and I went into this store, and I said, I want to buy some water. How much is it? And they said it was the equivalent of like 50 cents. And I didn't have it. I had 37. And I said, oh, I don't have 50 cents. And I went to walk out, and the man said, come back here. I said, what? He said, water is a God-given right. Take that bottle of water. And I was like, oh, thank you. Why don't you take the 37 cents? He said, absolutely not. You are hot, you are tired, take this water. God gave us this water, it's yours. If only we thought that way, if only we understood that the people in Flint, just like the people in every high-end suburb in Michigan, have a God-given right to the water. And they should not be poisoned, and they should not be expendables. And that's what they are. If you closely examine, somebody made the decision that these people are expendable.
When we look at things, sometimes we look at things in a very narrow view, and we don't understand the impacts or the effects of what's going to happen. I don't think that that's what happened here. I think it was very direct, and I think that it was very implicated that this was the route that they were going to take moving forward. Now, I have a large amount of family members that live in Flint, and the effects of what's going on is tragic. It's turmoil in that city from distrust and disbelief in what we call the American government, what we call a democracy. The people that we elected are the people that put us in this type of situation. And that is the most hurtful thing that I believe that the people in Flint are going through right now. Because, yes, we may be a city that has a large number of people that are poor people, but you are only as strong as your weakest link. So we have to build those people up in order to have a strong American society. And then you don't look at how the person treats the best person in the room. You judge a person off how they treat the worst person that's in the room or the lowest class person that's in the room. Now, we have to look at one thing when we look at this situation. I feel like, why Flint, right? Why would we allow this to happen in Flint? At one point in time, Flint was one of the cities in Michigan where we had a large number of factories and plants, thanks to GM and Ford and others. And all of those companies have shifted over time outside of the city of Flint. And those factories and manufacturing buildings are still there, but they are vacant, they are empty. And they have been that way for years. And like they have said, they have put a value on human life versus instead of implementing things and strategies and ways to be able to allow those people to work or manufacture products. And like Professor Broussard said, they'll come up with a counter argument. They'll say, well, I don't want to bring my company here. I don't want to bring my corporation here because I'm in fear of the life of the safety of my workers because of the crime rate, right? Well, we have to counter that. If there's more jobs, if there's better education, then guess what? You have people that are prideful. You have people that feel like the city is prestigious. You have people that feel like they are important and they are valued by someone. When you are able to do this to small children, which I have a niece and a nephew who are elementary aged, then you don't even value that life because you know the implications of what lead can do to young people, then you have been betrayed. But I think that we, those of us that are here, and especially those of us that are in the legal community, have an absolute responsibility to those individuals that have been betrayed and that have been victims of injustice. And so moving forward, I hope that we can come up with a solution of what we can implement and what we can do as a collective unit and as a collective body. I hope that's what we get out of this panel today.
Thank you. That was well said. So, Professor Broussard, you mentioned you believe that there is a due process issue at hand. Can you explain to the audience what due process is and touch briefly on substantive versus procedural?
Well, under the 14th Amendment, you have in the 14th Amendment, you have the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause. And generally speaking, the Equal Protection Clause protects against discrimination. It's just a shortcut way of explaining it. Whereas the Due Process Clause protects your rights, your fundamental rights, be they textual or non-textual. So when she talks about substantive, she's talking about rights that are derived from the Constitution. They're not in the Constitution, but they're of the Constitution. For example, the right to privacy, the right to marry. So there's nowhere where it states in the Constitution you have the right to marry. It's not textual, but it's non-textual. And the Ninth Amendment says we are saving a space for any other rights that you might come up with that we haven't articulated in this Constitution. So I believe, just personally, that a strong argument would be under that Due Process Clause, which says you have the right to life, liberty, and happiness. Well, liberty means your body should be free of being polluted, that you should be able to function and work and not be sick and not be sickened by your government, because the amendment starts out with no state shall. So I think you can make a due process argument saying your fundamental right to be free from contamination, to be free from pollutants that are knowingly put in your bloodstream is a strong argument. The argument that's not as strong but has been bolstered by recent events is the equal protection argument. Because as he said, when you argue equal protection, you cannot say you did it to me because I was poor, because poverty isn't recognized as a suspect classification. You can say you did it to me because I was black, because that is recognized as a suspect classification. The problem is, after the case of Washington versus Davis, the Supreme Court has said you have to prove not only that there is a discriminatory impact, but there's a discriminatory intent. So I maintain that as a result of folks being indicted for criminal behavior, that we should argue that the intent that is in that crime can be transferred and can be proof and evidence of the intent in the civil action. Because over the years, the court has not made it clear when they talk about the intent that is needed to prove discrimination, whether that intent is a civil intent, a preponderance of the evidence, or criminal intent beyond a reasonable doubt. That problem is solved if you argue they indicted these 6 people, and the intent that they showed in committing the crimes is also the intent that should be evident in them discriminating against the black folks in which they committed the crime against.
So to kind of give everyone an understanding of what Professor Broussard is talking about, and Travia and I, we're going to act as devil advocates and try to push back against what they're saying. And for everyone who doesn't know, Washington versus Davis was a situation where I think it was a state police test.
Washington, D.C.
Washington, D.C. A city police test was challenged as being discriminatory against African Americans, to where African Americans were disproportionately not passing the test. And the court held that, yes, the test was affecting African Americans, but there was no purpose, there was no racial animus to make it fall under equal protection. So what if I say to you, in this situation here, like in Flint, yes, certain races may be affected, but you can't prove any racial animus here. There's no purpose that you can see. And this goes for the whole panel.
Well, let me just briefly say, the cases that followed Washington versus Davis laid out a scheme by which you could show intent. And they said you can show intent with statistics. You can show intent by studies. So when you start building up evidence, and I think he articulated before, when you can say that 9 out of the 12 cities where emergency managers have been installed are African American, you have statistics now. You're building a case. So the important thing is, how do you prove intent? And intent can be proved with data. It can be proved with statistics. It can be proved with the criminal intent that we see that the court is, that the prosecutor is alleging that these folks knowingly, they knew the results of what they were doing and they did it nonetheless. So
And statistically, just to piggyback on what Professor Broussard is saying, because she's right, you can use, I mean, she's a professor, college professor, right? Your seizure con law professor, of course she's right. The statistics can be entered into evidence, and if you look at the statistics from the Census Bureau for Flint, you'll see that in 2013, 10% of Flint was white, 24% was Hispanic, and 27% were black. So that city was predominantly black and brown. And that's, I mean, I have a ton of other percentages. I won't bore you with all that. But it's that you can use those statistics that are there to prove the intent.
And can I just add, you know, I started by saying that I started working with the Florida Environmental Equity and Justice Commission, and that's why the commission was put together. In the 70s and 80s, you had some cases, you know, Love Canal being the big one, but you also started to have some other cases. And there was a sense that there was a disproportionate impact, but it had never been studied. And so the legal challenges were unsuccessful because you could never pass the intent muster. And so over and over and over again, despite organizing and using the courtroom to challenge what was perceived as environmental racism, the tool of courtroom was not an effective way to meet the demand of that change because the intent could not be proven. And so Clinton signed what was Executive Order 12989 or 898, I can't remember the order of those, which then kind of memorialized the federal and state discussions that started to be happening at that time about how could you prove disproportionate impact, how could you demonstrate intent. Or in the alternative, if you had something that was facially neutral as looked at by the court, how could you then point to other things? And so again, my expertise is in Florida. So it was with that 97, 98, 99 commission, and they looked statistically, they scientifically studied. And now in 2016, we say this as a statement. We say communities of color and low impact are disproportionately impacted by environmental hazards. We say that as a fact. But in 95, there was no study. You were trying to convince the legislature that there was a monster in the closet, even though we kind of had all seen examples. We had seen all of the crisis situations, but there had never been a study. And so that was kind of the genesis in Florida for the beginning of the EJ movement and trying to take examples throughout the state. And so the commission studied things like education, they studied race, they studied population density, rural versus urban. They studied whether or not you were connected to sewer or public facilities, whether or not you, was sewer, I have some other ones, but you know, there was a scientific way to then take that, and like I said, now in 2016, but it's very important that the point that you were making about how you have the constitutional right to not be contaminated, the jurisprudence on this is very young. We're not going back to the common law days. Like I said, 97, 98, like that's not that long ago. And we take for granted that in 2016, we make a statement of environmental racism. We have panels like that. We have examples, unfortunately, that continue to occur. But the jurisprudence here is in its infancy.
But I also think that even though this happened back in the 90s, where the idea of environmental justice, we have such an insurmountable burden to overcome when it comes to proving intent for discrimination purposes under the 14th Amendment. And so we know those environmental justice issues. I teach 18 to 22-year-olds. I don't need to go into any legalities for them to understand the common sense that there's racism that's in all parts of our country and in this world. But even though we have the 14th Amendment and we have this environmental justice, we still can't ever overcome, it's so hard to even try to litigate a case of environmental justice utilizing the Equal Protection Clause, where now they've moved over to the Civil Rights Act, but even then, it's still so difficult. We're seeing more and more segregation, as you said, in our public school systems. I mean, it doesn't take a genius to go around and see that schools schools in low-income communities and communities of color have very inadequate facilities compared to, let's say, Dr. Phillips High School. But still, we can't use the very essence of our Constitution, of the 14th Amendment, to not deny equal protection under the law to combat environmental racism issues. So here, again, we're seeing this awful crisis that occurred, and as Professor Broussard said, water is life. We're seeing T-shirts now being sold because of the Dakota Access Pipeline that Native Americans have said, we don't, the earth doesn't belong to us. We belong to the earth. And nature has rights in and of itself, and we need nature to survive. And the fact that the emergency manager solely wanted to save $5 million, which was an awful decision, because now they're spending billions and losing lives and all of the other health and impacts that we're going to have because of this. And it's just one example which sometimes out of tragedy can come, success. And maybe we need it to kind of slap us in the face. And I think I was talking with Professor Broussard the last time on a Flint panel where you said that you had gone to Cuba or something, and everyone always thinks, oh, that's not going to happen in my backyard. I just open up the faucet and water comes out, right? But here, their water was turning brown, and you have people in developing countries that walk miles every day to get 5 gallons of water, which they still have to treat to use, and we take the very essence of what we need to survive for granted. And here it slapped us in the face that it can happen right here in our backyard. And this is just a side note, because I know I'm rambling, but the Mosaic sinkhole, we could be experiencing the same thing that Flint is experiencing, and they're testing the wells and they're saying, oh, it's just fine. Well, they told the people in Flint it was just fine for almost a year. I mean, where people were going and testing themselves and the lead and everything, and even the own Michigan Department of Environmental Quality said, oh, those tests are flawed. So how are we supposed to trust?
Explain that further, the Mosaic sinkhole.
So in phosphate mining, Mosaic Company is actually the largest fertilizer company in the entire nation. Phosphate mining is how we get fertilizers, which I'll make a plug for, instead of getting the St. Augustine green grass, try to find some native species that you can plant in your own front and backyard, or a plug for ideas for us, getting some type of fleet farming to come in, because you don't need all these fertilizers and pesticides to win Yard of the Month. That's why we're having all of the green algae and problems in South Florida, and actually in the Indian River Lagoon and all over. We're having a huge water crisis in Florida. And I'm sure Professor Abrams can even speak to that even further. But this company mines phosphate, and I don't know if you guys know this or not, but for many, many years, they have not complied with the law. And the sinkhole opened up probably a month, maybe 6 weeks ago. 45-foot sinkhole where radioactive wastewater starts dumping right into our Florida aquifer. The news has not covered this, just like they're not covering the Dakota Access Pipeline. It's not mainstream media. And it still shocks me when I say it and people are like, oh, wow, this is happening, because it's a very, very big crisis that we're about to encounter. This same company, just last year, got into one of the biggest settlements, a $2 billion settlement with the Department of Justice, the EPA, the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, because they were not complying with the disposal of the radioactive waste to the point where it was so corrosive. They required them in the settlement to form a trust fund to close these stacks, these gypsum stacks, where they were mining the phosphate. And they put $630 million in this trust. Well, the company decides, we don't want to close the gypsum stacks yet. We want to wait until the investment grows to about 1.8 billion before we go ahead and close it out. And too sorry, too late, too bad. It collapses, sinkhole opens up, and it's just dumping radioactive wastewater. They've been testing the wells within a 3-mile radius and saying that they're okay. But it's the same thing that, I mean, I can't trust that because most of the testing is being done by the same company. And they didn't even notify our own governor for 3 weeks that this was occurring. So it's Flint all over again.
Yeah, can I say that Flint is the canary in the mine? Because Flint, it just happened, we found out, it made national press, it's abhorrent. This is being replicated all over the country.
Yeah.
Wherever there are poor people, wherever there are disadvantaged people, wherever the infrastructure has not been shored up. You know, we talk about American exceptionalism. We talk about we're number one.
Mm-hmm.
We got bridges that we have a town of 2,000 people that are underwater right now in North Carolina and South Carolina because the levees, same Katrina thing, the levees were not shored up. So Flint is the canary in the coal mine, and it tells us if this is happening in Flint, this is happening everywhere. But the other comment I wanted to make was, when we talk about remedies, when we talk about making an equal protection argument and not being able to, what we're talking about is a court decision that was made by the United States Supreme Court. If the United States Supreme Court can make a decision, they can unmake it. You have to vote. You got to know what's at risk during an election. This Supreme Court that's going to be appointed can make the difference in another Flint occurring right here in Orlando. A Supreme Court can say, we made a mistake with Washington versus Davis, we changed our mind, all you have to show is yada, 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 and bam, it changes in just the flip of a decision, the relief and the remedy that is given to the people who are injured.
Thank you. Before we continue, oh,
Real quick, I need to correct. I looked down at my notes and I gave you guys some statistics earlier. Those were poverty statistics. So I wanted to make sure that I had that correct for you. The April or the 2010, it was 56% of Flint was African American and white was 37%. I just got excited and I was looking at my poverty stats.
all right. So before we continue, we want to make this an interactive panel. So we're recording it live via Facebook. So if you guys have questions out there on Facebook, please feel free to submit those. And if you guys in the audience have questions as well, please feel free to ask at any time. You don't have to wait until the end. Now, we've talked about equal protection. Can we elaborate on that for those who haven't had con law or haven't had the pleasure of being in your con law class? Can you just kind of explain how equal protection is analyzed, rational basis, strict scrutiny?
So the way equal protection works is, or the principle behind equal protection is that like groups should be treated in a similar manner. And the kind of protection that you get depends on what category you fall into. So if you fall into, if a law is passed that's discriminatory, but it's discriminatory in an economic way, then generally speaking, the court will use what is called rational basis. The court will say, look, we're going to give deference to the state. You know what your finances are like. For example, if the state wanted to say, we will charge $85 for a driver's license, and your argument was, but I can't afford $85, the court would say, too bad. The state of Florida has the authority to do that. So that's the most, rational basis is where the most deference is given to the state and to the legislative body. On the opposite pole is strict scrutiny. So when something happens and there is a suspect classification, and suspect classifications, race, ethnicity, all of your rights fall under that, national origin, colorism in some places. So there are all of these things that are suspect just on the face, laws that are suspect. For example, if you said Puerto Ricans can't vote, that's a suspect classification because you are treating a group of people different from another group of people. So equal protection says equal things or equal groups are treated equally, with the exception of the categories that we have. So when you are making an argument and you are arguing, if I'm arguing before the court that Flint, Michigan, what has happened in Flint, Michigan has been directed at people of color, what I want the court to do is I want them to turn to Flint, Michigan and say, you got to give me an excellent reason why this happened. If you can't give me an excellent reason why these people were treated differently from others, then this law is no good and it's knocked down. So that's basically the way equal protection works. Now, remember what we're talking about here. We're talking about protection and remedies under the Constitution. But there are some statutory remedies that we haven't talked about yet, and there's some statutes that can be used to affect a remedy. But when you're talking about the Constitution and you're talking about equal protection, like groups being treated in a similar manner, that's the way that operates. The Due Process Clause generally applies to fundamental rights. So it means you have to treat me, you have to give me process, a certain process before you take away one of my rights. If I'm entitled to a hearing, if I'm entitled to notice, if I'm entitled to whatever I'm entitled to, whatever is due me is the due process that I'm entitled to before you can take away a fundamental right. So that's why I said liberty is a fundamental right, and why I would use the Due Process Clause to say, you got to give a very good reason for taking away my liberty from having my body to be free, to allow my body to be free from contaminants.
Okay, thank you. So this is only supposed to be a temporary or interim source of water for the residents of Flint. They had a grand scheme to build their own pipeline, and according to the city council's notes, this was supposed to save them over $200 million over the course of 25 years. So, I mean, let's suppose, and you guys didn't see those air quotes, but let's suppose that they were not aware of the potential effects of the water. Is this not a good reason or a possible reasonable temporary solution to use the Flint, Michigan River?
What I understood, or excuse me, that's loud. What I understood was that by them changing and flipping to the Flint water supply, they could have still treated the water.
Yeah.
So by treating the water, because Flint's not the only place where there's lead in the pipes. It's all over the place. January of 2016, there was a city or a town in, I want to say it's Ohio or Louisiana. I want to say Ohio. I had the article. I left it. But there was another town that was on the brink of Flint, just like we are here in Florida. If that hole collapses, even more. But what they could have done was treated the water. And that water treatment would have prevented the lead that's already in those pipes from coming through the system and making its way to homes. So there's lead in pipes under the ground everywhere in every city. They just have a different way of, they treat the water, and then if they find all those parts that Mr. White talked about, well, then they're supposed to replace that pipe. It used to be, I think, that they would have to replace the whole entire pipe system, but now I think there was an amendment to the Safe Water Act, if I remember correctly, and they only have to replace them on like a 7-year basis or something like that. Don't quote me, because I read it all and it's all up there, but don't remember it exactly.
Well, the other fact is, they started using bottled water for government workers. So they had notice and they had knowledge. So, you know, it's okay to sit here and say, oh, they didn't know. The moment they found out, they started ordering bottled water for government workers. And if GM was concerned about
Exactly.
rusting out parts
Thank you.
of cars,
Exactly.
they had notice. And so I think we should rely real heavily on the fact that they knew what was going on. And that's what makes it criminal, and that's what makes it willful, because their receipts for the bottled water they bought for the government workers because they knew the water wasn't safe to drink.
Right.
And
And
the lesson to be learned here is Flint is not alone. Infrastructure needs to be repaired in many, many, many places. What's different about Flint is some of the things that we can point to in hindsight that demonstrate a malicious intent. But again, understanding the incremental decisions for environmental managers or I'm sorry, for managers who are making decisions based on budgetary concerns, there's not always a connection of the dot at those instances. They don't necessarily have the information necessary to understand the impact of the community. They're making a decision in a vacuum. It's myopic. It's intended to be that way. Because once you broaden it, once you start to notice folks, once you start to ask questions and get answers, then you have an obligation to do other things. I know from DEP, and I actually worked on the Mosaic case in conjunction with DEP and currently with the county, but when you have a project and you start saying EJ, is there an EJ issue here? People start to get a little, I don't know, check that out. So when I was at DEP, I served as the state coordinator, the liaison to EPA. And so again, trying to insert this EJ issue into decisions that were made along the way. But you're right. Flint is the canary, two things. It is the canary in the coal mine for how infrastructure replacement is needed many places, And again, back in the day, it used to be legal for you to do many of the things that you're doing now. There are a million exemptions for how we pollute ourselves on a daily basis. Again, I litigated. I kept some quick things that sometimes I had 10 minutes in the motion for summary judgment, so I had to tell the judge things like it's legal to put fertilizer on the ground, but we all know it pollutes groundwater. But it's a legal application of a pollutant to the ground. So if you're a golf course, you can legally pollute every single day. But there's ways that we try and contain it. There's stormwater management systems. There's infrastructure requirements to try and channel and funnel and test and all those sorts of things. Equally with Mosaic. The aquifer is deep below us. Florida, the water crisis in Florida is real. Water is a God-given right. However, it is being privatized every single day.
Yeah.
And so what we take for granted, imagine our grandparents coming today and seeing us drinking out of bottled water. They would have thought it was ridiculous. They did think it was ridiculous. And so will our grandchildren's grandchildren's grandchildren, what will they think about clean drinking water? Will it be a privilege? Will it be something that rich people can afford? Will it be something that white people get to drink? Water is a crisis in Florida, and Florida is very unique. Our subsurface is unique. The aquifer is very, very deep. And so while the Mosaic is discharging into the aquifer, surface wells are shallow. There's a difference why we call it superficial groundwater. It's not deep. So what are you testing for? What are the tests really testing? Are they testing the ground? Are they testing the discharge that's going into the aquifer? And again, if you imagine kind of a deep end and a shallow end to the pool, if you're discharging to the deep end, but you take a sample out of the shallow end, what is it going to show? It is going to show that it's clean. But what is the test guaranteed to? What is it designed to do? Is it designed to inform citizens about what's going into the aquifer, or is it designed to inform citizens about what's in their well? Because those are two very different intents.
Right.
Those are two very different applications of data in a way that, ultimately, if we're not plugged in, if we don't understand the issues, we get the short end of the stick.
So I have a question too.
I just wanted to add to that
Go ahead.
as well. You're absolutely right in that the American Society of Civil Engineers they do an infrastructure report card, and they actually gave all of the infrastructure in the United States a grade of D. Okay? So, we have old pipes and contaminated with lead. They predict that it's going to cost over $1 trillion over the next 25 years. And I am a huge promoter of, climate justice and climate action, but we're focusing a lot and probably the majority of our energy on having renewable, pun intended, I guess, in that, renewable energy and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but we're not putting the same kind of funding into our water infrastructure. And as we know, water is life, and this is going to be a significant problem, as Professor Broussard and everyone else on the panel has echoed. It's not just a Flint issue. It's not just a Florida issue. Worldwide, we're going to start seeing water wars. They've already designated the UN that national or security all over the world is at risk for natural resources. And I blame our environmental legal framework and our environmental laws that we have. And it is an injustice and a disservice that we don't give nature rights. Because as you just said, basically our environmental laws give us a license to pollute and to contaminate and to release toxics into our air, into our water, and into our ground on a regular basis. So this is why we're having all of these issues. And it was a clear violation of the Safe Drinking Water Act because they're supposed to monitor the water on a regular, frequent basis. They're supposed to treat it with corrosion control and all of these things. And when they first asked them about it, they're like, yeah, we're doing some treatment. And then when they dug deeper, what kind of treatment? They admitted they're not doing any. So I don't know what kind more intent or willful disregard and reckless conduct and level of gross negligence you need to prove the things that were happening here.
So I have a question to challenge all of you, and Ms. Balls, I know you're under a time constraint, so I'll give you first crack at this
I have to teach class.
if you would like. But you've all spoken about voting rights as being fundamental, or spoken in the same sentence of fundamental rights and voting rights. But the Constitution, voting is not written anywhere in the Constitution. And I think the district courts in this Flint situation have said that voting rights are not fundamental. And even if it is, in this situation here with Flint, the rights that are being affected are not voting rights because no one is stopping citizens from voting. What is happening after they've already voted may be affected. So what would you say if someone were to come with that argument?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we had discussed too is the guarantee clause, guaranteeing a Republican form, of government is in our Constitution. If this appellate court decides to affirm this district court decision, to me it would be just as dark of a chapter in our American history as the Citizens United case was, because the fact that you can actually say that we don't have, that voting is not a fundamental right, basically strips away what this whole system of democracy is. Just because you can actually, and I think it was actually quoted in the appellate brief, vote. Voting is not just going to the ballot box, marking an X and dropping it into, the bucket. It's the whole fact that you're electing a body and these officials to be your voice. And I will just want to say something too, because Professor Broussard brought up a point which is dear to my heart as a Boricua, half Puerto Rican, half Nicaraguan, Nica Boricua actually. And the fact that Puerto Ricans don't have a right to vote. The same thing with emergency manager being appointed in Flint is happening on the entire island of Puerto Rico of 3.5 million people, where they have just appointed a fiscal control board because we need to pay hedge funds and vulture funds, stripping away basic rights, basic necessities, closing down schools, closing down hospitals, taking away not having any kind of environmental enforcement really on the island. There's over 75% of the landfills are toxic and getting ready to blow up. There on the island. And again, you have an entire island of brown people where, again, these tyranny type of government control is being implemented on this entire island. And it is a fundamental right, at least in my opinion, to be able to vote. And it's very important, as Professor Broussard said, we're always talking about the presidents, Hillary and Trump, but we're also emphasizing the down ballot, right? And how important your local government is to the very decisions that are happening in your own backyard. And when you then implement one, not even a board, one emergency manager who has absolute power to do away with ordinances, to fire the local officials that were just voted into. I mean, I just don't, it's like a modern day dictatorship that we're experiencing. And just very, horrible and horrific that it's even happening.
Thank you.
Sure. So Professor Broussard, voting is not a fundamental right. It's not been recognized as a fundamental right.
I absolutely disagree with that 100%.
Okay, well, that was my point. That was my point. I've always thought that voting was a fundamental right. It is deeply rooted in our nation's conscience and history. So I don't know how we got to it's not a fundamental right. But so one of the things with this voting that was interesting to me was that there was already this Michigan law in place under, I believe it was called Public Bill 4 or
Yeah.
something like that. So it was already there.
Exactly.
And then the citizens by referendum got rid of 4. But what they did was they made it where they can't get rid of 436 now. And that involves voting. So for me, yes, voting is a fundamental right. I guess I don't understand the question of how we got to it. It wasn't.
Well, you know, all you have to do is look at the Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment says that African-American men who were former slaves have the right to vote. Certainly, you would not give African-American former men slaves the right to vote if everybody else didn't have them. And by everybody else, I mean the white men. So
Exactly.
implicit
White men that own
in
it.
implicit in giving African-American men the right to vote in the 15th Amendment is the understanding that everybody else, all the other white men have the right to vote. And this is why I think the statute comes in. So how do you get to this right to vote through the statute? You get through it through the Voting Rights Act, because what the Voting Rights Act says under Section 2, it recognizes. So we're not dealing with the Constitution now. So we don't have to jump over that hoop of impact and intent. What the Voting Rights Act says in Section 2, it says the types of voting practices and procedures that may violate Section 2 include, but are not limited to, and it goes on to a bunch of them. Number 3, replacing elected officials with appointed officials. So right in the Voting Rights Act, this type of behavior is proscribed. This is exactly what we're talking about. So even if you cannot get to it through the 14th Amendment, you can get to it through the Voting Rights Act, because this is the exact thing that the Voting Rights Act was set up to prevent. And it's written, they didn't knock this down in Shelby County. And it's still standing. It says, this is prohibited, and this is exactly what happened. And so I think there's a strong, strong argument to be made using Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, saying that what you have done is you have abrogated the right to vote by violating Section 3, because no matter what you say constitutionally, this is statutory, and the statute has been violated.
Just to speak to that and to the impact of what that actually looks like. Last year around this time, I was able to speak to City Councilman Eric Mays in Flint, and if it's a lie, he told it. He said that when they were making the decisions about the water situation, the emergency manager and the water company, the city council wasn't involved. The same people that have to answer to the people that voted them in, they had no idea what was going on. So they couldn't answer the question of the people of how did this happen? Because they weren't involved with the meetings where this took place. And that's like she said. So when you replace the people that you voted in with somebody that is appointed, then they don't answer to you anymore.
Exactly.
To the very people that they're supposed to be representing. And that's why something like this can happen. And I just wanted to give a reality check or a reality sense of what that really looks like in implication.
Thank you, Brandon. Speaking of reality, you mentioned that you have family and friends that still reside in Flint, Michigan. Are they still experiencing any water issues at this time?
I'm gonna tell you what, the media is off of it, but they not off of it. Every single day, Rasheed Wallace, who's a former basketball player for the Detroit Pistons, is quoted saying, when you wake up in the morning, or when I wake up in the morning, what are the basic things you do? You use the restroom, takes water. You brush your teeth, takes water. You wash your face, takes water. You take a shower, it takes water. These are the things, besides the fact that they can't drink the water, these are the things that are affected. You have a baby. How do you have a baby and not be able to use the water to wash your baby or to clean your baby? You're a grown person, a grown adult. What do you look like using bottles of water this big or even gallons to fill up your tub to wash yourself to be fresh for the next day. Imagine how much bacteria that is. And you have to look at the area of Flint and how I know that the equal protection argument is solid, but then it has holes in it, because this is how I know this was a direct impact, because of the fact that the emergency manager was a black man. So if you look at that and you see, wow, how are they gonna say it was racist when a black person made the decision, right? And so we look at it also, all the areas that are around Flint, the perimeter. I'm talking about you cross over a bridge. I had a old high school teammate, and I wasn't as aware because I was going to white school at the predominantly white school at the time, and they called it. It was a bridge that crossed over into their neighbor from Flint to what's called Flushing, and he called it the bridge to Africa, right? I mean, just a bridge over, and they weren't affected by the water issue. You have Flint Township, which is right across. You cross over the highway, and they weren't affected by the water issue. All these areas predominantly white and affluent people who living in these neighborhoods. Now we have to look at it from that aspect, because then we're able to realize the impact on it. You know, when we have in all respect due to my brother, and we all love him, but Barack Obama went to Flint and took a sip of the water and said it's okay for you all to drink. And to me, that's not fair to the citizens of this country. To me, that's not fair to my family, my niece who is 10 years old, who has to go to school every day, who looks up to Barack Obama, who looks up to the elected officials, who wants to come to college, who wants to do good in life. But this may set her back because she may have a learning disability. Mm-hmm. This may set her back because she may have behavioral issues and she don't know how to react to it. This may set her back from being in the seat that each and every one of you are in this building today. This may set her back from being able to reach her dreams. And that breaks my heart, that an elected official who wouldn't even let his children drink the water will let my niece drink this water.
And the emergency manager got a promotion. He's now the emergency manager of the Detroit Public School System.
Oh my God.
That, yeah.
And if I could just kind of piggyback off of that, because, you know, again, I've spent my career in the last 20 years in Florida, and I think Flint certainly is an example that we can all point to. It gets everybody's attention. It's become it's become like an adjective or a noun. But you know, in this audience, we may have people from Pensacola. Anybody from Pensacola? Ever heard of Mount Dioxin? Belglade, burning of the sugar canes. I've been to public hearings where the water looked just like it looked in Flint, but there was no national media cry. And the people looked just like the people looked in Flint. And the decisions were made to put people on bottled water before bottled waters were available in vending machines. So Flint is not unique. It's not, unfortunately, it's not unique. It will happen again. And so the question becomes, what do we do with the tools in our toolbox as lawyers, as understanding that environmental racism is something that's real, because it's not just the disproportionate impact to low-income and low-income and minority communities. It's the cumulative impact. So you have situations like Flint, when our local governing boards are making decisions about where to improve infrastructure, where to spend the dollars. Where are they spending it? Are they spending it in communities that look like us? Back in the day, iron pipes were how you laid infrastructure. We all know now they corrode. It's not an effective way to get water from point A to point B. We know that. But now it becomes an infrastructure repair, becomes a bill, it becomes tax dollars that need to get spent, and people who need to make decisions about where to spend it and who's going to do the work. And those decisions impact not just in low-income communities, communities of color, but then you have the cumulative effect. So infrastructure repair may not be occurring in Pine Hills or Paramore, but then you have medical incinerators. And so we have these facially neutral laws, siting laws, that say if you're going to have a landfill, it can't be within 100 feet of this and this and this, and it has to be within 100 feet of this and this and this. It needs to be next to a fire hydrant. It needs to have a fire lane so the fire trucks can come there. It can't be next to a school. It can't be next to a hospital. And then there's all these code things that it can't be in. And then the next thing you know, the only places that it could really be are in neighborhoods where people look like me instead of people that look like Windermere. Because that's the only place the siting laws, and we have examples on a daily basis, and it's not just environmental. They're doing it now with medical marijuana. Counties are rushing to the books to try and get siting laws on the book, so that way if it passes, we can figure out where is it going to go. And I can tell you it's not going to go next to Disney.
Thank you very much.
And I want to say this problem is old. This is not new. It's just that we have social media, we have 24-hour news cycles. I grew up in Chicago, on the west side of Chicago in the projects. And the way we got rid of our trash is we would put it in a paper bag, put it in the incinerator, strike a match, and light it. And it came up. So everybody had asthma. Everybody had bronchitis. Everybody, I mean, we were burning raw trash into the air in the neighborhood. And so if there are 500 families in a 3-block area, you replicate that 500 times every other day, we're breathing in trash. So this goes a long way back. It's just that I think what has happened is we're more socially aware of the situation, and we're now motivated to do something about it.
And again, even those regulations, they're still, 84 is when we started to get clued to the idea that burying our waste is probably not an effective way to get rid of it.
Yeah.
84 is not that long ago.
And we're going to wrap up here. We have some questions from the audience. Before we do, I have a few more questions specifically for Brandon, though.
I just have one question for you, Brandon. Can you think of any way that Flint has helped its residents during this crisis?
The city? The city of Flint?
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what the residents did to help themselves. Last year, the city elected their first African-American woman mayor that the city has ever had, and that's one step that they wanted towards justice. The emergency manager has been removed thanks to the state. We have city council people who really care about the community, who want to see the best for the community. I mean, they have activated, and thanks to the national government and to the state government, due to this unfortunate event, they have been able to give people, felons, who weren't able to get jobs before, able to get jobs now, delivering water to people and driving trucks. They've been able to. They've been able to utilize more of the spaces, the green spaces that the city has, and they try to garden and teach young people gardening skills and different things like that. But you're still using the water that is contaminated. But I think that those skills can be utilized for actual in the future for those individuals, for those high school students and different people to learn how to do these things. And I mean, it's a city that they're taking pride in each other. I talked to a friend on yesterday, and he said that the city is more unified than it has ever been before due to this tragic incident and things. Sometimes, like funerals, it's the only thing that could bring a family together. So unfortunately, this is an event that has actually brought more people together than ever before in this city.
Okay. A couple more questions for Brandon.
Why did you come to law school?
Why did I come to law school?
Yeah.
The reason I came to law school, and I'm actually the only person on my mother's side of the family that is in college currently. And I wanted to set a precedence. I wanted to set a standard. Like I said, my niece, she's very inspirational to me. She saves money in her little piggy bank and says, I want to go to college one day, Uncle B. And that just brightens my heart up. And even though she is below the poverty line, she says, I'm going to get some water, Uncle B, and I'm going to give it to the poor. And it's just a beautiful spirit in her, and that's what keeps me motivated and keeps me driven. But I understand that with this voice and with this platform and with professors like Professor Bouchard and each and every one of you all on this panel and the individuals of the ELS, that with this voice, we are able to make a difference. Somebody is going to tune in that is going to help us make this difference that we need to. And it is the legal impacts and legal implications that last the longest. If you look at our federal government, the 3 branches, which one is the oldest? The Supreme Court, is that right? So if we look at that, the biggest impact that we can make, I believe, is within us, in the legal field and in the legal ramifications. And I think that, out of all of my friends who are in situations where they made mistakes and different things like that, and I was able to make it out of that situation, I have to represent for those individuals. I have to put the city on my back, and I appreciate each and every one of y'all for listening to me. But I'm here for the grace of God, and I'm also here to represent the people who are underprivileged, who are underrepresented, who do not have a voice, who have been left out in the cold. Thank you.
We have some questions. Please.
Yes. My first question, it sounded like the focus is on making sure that the vote is protected, and we need to be able to vote the leaders that are going to put those individuals in the positions to make the effective changes. I'd like to bring up, however, a 2016 Pew Research poll that shows that in 2012 there was a 53% voter turnout, and of the 241 that are eligible, 129 actually are casting a vote. The second study is a Gallup research poll, which 6 in 10 are confident in the accuracy of U.S. voting. So, posing those 2 points, are there alternatives to simply the vote? That people may be looking for other answers simply because of that lack of confidence. You cite that we voted these individuals in office, and look at what has happened so far, and people might be looking for alternatives. If there is such an alternative, what do you guys see, and how could law play a factor?
If I may, I think, and I hope I understand your question correctly, I think that for me it's that they voted for who the councilman or whoever they picked and the governor, they voted for them. They didn't vote for the emergency manager. So that's the hiccup, and that's the rub for me, is now you have some other individual who's been appointed, and I understand the appointment process and how that works, but this appointment is not like the president's cabinet, where you elect a president and then some cabinet member says, you know what, president, we no longer have to listen to you anymore. We're going to do what I say. And to me, that's what happened here. I don't know if that entirely answers your question.
I think I understood what you said. I think people are disenchanted because how many times can you mess over me? You know, I vote, I think things are going to change, and they don't change. I vote for X, Y, and Z, and instead of giving me X, Y, and Z, you give me A, B, and C. And I think people just say, my vote isn't going to matter anyway. My vote isn't going to count anyway, because all politics is local. And you see that which is closest to you, and if you don't see any change, or if you don't see the local politics being impacted by your vote because you don't see the bigger picture, you don't see the Supreme Court, you don't see the Senate, you don't see international affairs. You see that you live in Flint, Michigan, and you can't turn on the faucet. And the people that you relied upon to help you turn on that faucet didn't do it, whether it be because they abdicated their authority or because their authority was taken from them. And so you say, why should I even bother to vote? So it's our job, part of our job is to say, you must though. You must. Because you know, like I know, that if you don't vote, there's a record kept of your voting history. So politicians are very clear on who they can ignore. Because if you aren't going to vote, if you aren't going to help put them in office, you have no currency. So they can ignore you. So we have to educate people as to how the political process works. Because after all, it is a democracy, it is all of that good stuff, but it's also politics. And you've got to understand how the political process works and how you make your voice heard. If you don't vote and folks know you don't vote, they know they can ignore you.
And if I can piggyback, being in local government, Andrea's a colleague of mine, so we, on a daily basis, a weekly basis, I have a meeting that's on my calendar because of a phone call or an email to the mayor or the commissioner. They've sent an email, they want answers, sometimes I would say about a week, because some of them can be answered with phone calls from staff, but when we get into delegations and when we get into, I'm in the land use section, when we get into concessions that are going to be made in the permitting process, citizens are able to reach their local commissioners. But to your point, there is this numbness, is this disenfranchise. We have been sold this, this marketing campaign that our vote doesn't matter. That we can't impact these decisions, but we can never have the political capital if we don't participate. But that is not the only tool in our toolbox. If we're going to organize ourselves into community action groups, if we're going to demand that not just elected officials, but everyone who's making those incremental decisions that I talked about along the way, are we going to show up? When due process affords us a notice of a public meeting, are we going to show up? Now, this is my passion. This is what I have spent my life doing, and I on a daily basis, I'm not fun to sit next to at Thanksgiving because my family's sick and tired of hearing about it. Black people need to be engaged in environmental issues, but there's reasons why we're not. You cannot engage, this is more like a want. When our needs are not being met, if we're not safe, if we don't have access to adequate health care, if we're concerned about whether or not our children are going to a failing school, taking time off from work to go to a public hearing, it's not connected to your life. Now, when it blows up, or you start to see things that are being built, or you start to see that, hey, wait a second, they got a new community center and we didn't get a new community center, or their pipes are being replaced and our pipes aren't being replaced. It is a direct connection from the fact that we don't participate. But there are other things that are keeping us from participating. Our job occurs between 8 and 5. People can't take off time to come down. If you punch a clock, if you punch a clock at Disney World and you need to be there for your shift, and taking time off means less money in your paycheck, you're not always afforded the opportunity, even though you've been given notice, even though they can check the due process box, even though that they're holding a public meeting, they evaluate the permit criteria for these things, and they're going to issue the permit. But the impact on your life, you may have not had an opportunity to participate because of other things. And so it is my passion for environmental issues to become for people who look like me to understand the impact and how to participate, because it is a game that is played at the political level, and we can only join that game if we have political capital to spend, and if we do not vote, they will ignore us every time.
And I can tell you, I served on the school board in Alexandria, Virginia, and when the room was full because a certain issue came before the school board, we noticed it. We noticed who was standing and who came and what the issue was, and who was there made a difference on how you voted.
And it's happening right now. There's a board commission right now going on. People in orange T-shirts there to support one side versus the other.
Yeah.
And it's happening right now on our ballot. If you're a voter in Orange County, educate yourselves. There's charter amendments on the ballot. There's a state amendment in the Constitution. So it's difficult sometimes to reach the audience because so many other issues that are attacking our livelihood, attacking our personal safety, attacking us on a daily basis become the priority. If we can't go to the grocery store and ensure that our children are going to come home safe, how do we find the time to participate in environmental issues? But they are just as important, because we are the ones that are disproportionately represented with asthma, miscarriage rate, cancer rates, because those environmental hazards are placed in our community. They're cumulatively placed in our community. We're not just hit with a landfill. We're hit with bad pipes, a landfill, an incinerator, the list goes on and on.
Railroad tracks.
Right.
Where trains that were carrying chemicals over the years, and the chemicals I had family members where every woman in the family had breast cancer, and the railroad tracks ran right next to the house. And so that something was leaking from those trains that got into the ground, that got into the groundwater.
Just a note, fertilizer, arsenic is applied because it keeps the weeds down. That's an illegal application of a known contaminant to the ground.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna answer your question in a different format. First, I'm gonna agree with part of what they said, because a young man made a quote at a forum that I was at. He said that if you're not at the table, then you're on the plate. So that's one thing that we have to understand, is that we have to figure out a way to get at the table. Now, when it comes to an alternative to voting, if you look at big corporations, I'm gonna give you an example. My cousin works for a union for a railroad company, right? The railroad company per se doesn't have a vote, but each and every one of the railroad workers who are part of that union, they put money into that union, and then they lobby for whatever decisions they want to make. I think that one thing that we don't have is a collective agenda when you're talking about black and brown people. We have to put together a collective agenda for what we want. We can't just say we have voting power, now do this or we're not going to vote for you. We have to put that voting power up, and then we have to figure out a way to collectively put an agenda together. And then third, we have to figure out some economic resources that we can put together to push whatever it is that we want. So if we get a senator or if we get a congressperson into office, we're able to fund the bill that we want. We're able to put money behind the research that they need to be able to pass that bill on our behalf.
And we can be the soldiers in this market. We really can, by being lawyers, by having a particular skill set, a particular knowledge set. again, a community garden, something as simple as a community garden. It seems like that's a great idea. We're going to get the church together. We're going to, get the labor donated. We're going to get the supplies donated. But then you start getting into zoning. Is it allowed? Is it prohibited? All of these things. Heaven forbid you take a piece of property that then becomes economically advantageous for development. And so we can be the soldiers in this army to try and protect those that need protection from the environmental justice communities, so that it's not just about the vote, but it's about just like there's a cumulative impact attacking us, there can be a cumulative effect, a cumulative impact protecting us. But sometimes we don't always connect those dots. We don't see the value in forums like this and having these discussions to maybe it will be somebody's passion to pick this up and become their career path. And then there's another soldier in my army.
Okay, we'll wrap up with one last question.
Thank you very much. Being born and raised Flintstone, I definitely appreciate this college for having this discussion on my hometown. And I also would like to give a comment to Brandon. I'd like to thank you for taking the path that you've chosen. You are definitely representing Flint well. I know I'm proud of you, and I know the 810 was proud of you as well. So, any Flintstone could tell you that using the Flint River as a water supply would be a bad idea. I mean, I grew up in Flint Township. I grew up by the Flint River. I went to a school that's located on the Flint River. I was born in a hospital that was on the banks of the Flint River. So we already knew that there was an issue with the water source. What we didn't know was the issue with the pipes. And was there a regulatory body that should have said something from not only making the decision to use the Flint River as a water source, but also examining the condition of the pipes? And if so, why didn't they say anything?
The research that I've done for this panel, what I came to understand, and maybe I forget your name.
Georgiana Holmes.
Georgiana. Maybe Georgiana knows better than I do, but from what I've found is that most of the pipes are already covered with lead. We just treat them. We treat our water so that it keeps the lead from getting into our water system.
But if I had to pass the buck, it would be to the Michigan EPA, the state of Michigan, because the buck stops there. I mean, it's their job to test the water. It's their job to decide what, if any, chemicals should go in the water to abate whatever the bacteria and the lead and everything else. I think the buck stops with them. I do think the federal EPA has to share some of that blame too, because why have a federal EPA if you're not going to have some sort of oversight over the states? So I think you have to go right to the people they're getting a check every 2 weeks or whenever to make sure that these procedures are in place. And so they really and truly dropped the ball on that, because, as you said, anybody in the neighborhood could tell you that you couldn't drink the water. You didn't have to have a degree. You didn't have to be a GS-13 to figure out that the water was. So what you are depending upon, the people of your state, to make the judgment that, yeah, in its current state, the water you can't drink it, but we can treat it. And while we're treating the water, we also have to recognize, they know the last time they replaced the pipes, the 12th of never, right? So they know that the pipes are corroded. If you can't depend on the people that you elect, if you can't depend on your government, and I asked the question, we were talking beforehand, what do you get for being an American beside a passport? What should you get? Should you be protected from the lead in the pipes? Should you be protected from the polluted water? Should you be protected from incineration and sinkholes? Maybe we can't prevent everything that occurs, but we certainly, the government at a minimum, should take care of those things that they know. They knew. If you knew in your neighborhood, they knew.
All right, one more. She's been waiting patiently. One more.
I wanted to ask a question for the debate over fundamental rights of voting. And I guess my question is whether they're fundamental or not, citizens got the right to vote at the inception of America. However, minority citizens, it took 2 amendments and 2 more congressional acts. Is it something that needs to be legislated to be inherent? And if it can be taught, what is it that actually needs taught. If we have half of the people who think it's inherent, it's a positive right, and for the rest of us, it's a negative right that we had to fight for, how do you then teach the implementation of it without that powerful centuries of legislation that came with it for non-Black Americans?
Well, I think you do just that. You teach it because, accurately speaking, that's not quite correct. Everybody didn't have the right to vote. Remember, you had to be white, male, and you had to be a landowner. So initially, even white men who were not landowners were not included and were not able to vote. But voting has become the cornerstone of our democracy. So initially, you're right, it was something we did. But we've come to recognize that at the very cornerstone of the democracy is the right to vote. One man, one vote. And you're right, we went through an evolutionary period where white men with property were able to vote, and then it moved up, and once they got rid of the test for religion and all of the different other tests, other white men who did not own property were able to vote. Let's not forget, we've got Native Americans who've been left out of everything, right? So it has been an evolutionary process. But we've come to recognize that it's a fundamental right. We've come to recognize that it's the cornerstone of our democracy, and we need to shout that and let everybody know that, because that's what we do that's how we sell ourselves to the rest of the world, right? That's what gives us the moral authority, or the lack thereof, to sell our brand of democracy to the rest of the world. We say all men are created equal, using men generically, right? We say all men have the right to vote. We say all men are equally protected. So when we don't, as a nation, protect those proclamations, we lose our moral authority to tell anybody else in the world what to do or how to do it.
I advise the Environmental Protection Commission. They also serve as staff for almost all of the lake advisory boards in this county. And, there's an ordinance or a resolution or something that sets up the makeup. And so, number one, your commissioners appoint the representation on those boards. Who sits on those boards? Is it developers that sit on their boards? Is it members from the community? Is it members from the regulated community? Is it the members of the regulating community? And then they make recommendations to the board to try and make sure that while they've delegated decisions to a board to then make a recommendation, it's the elected officials that are making, but not just public participation in the boards, but representation on the boards. I mean, we struggle sometimes to try and keep our board staffed.
Go ahead.
I can't let this go. I have to speak to something you said about voting. Voter suppression is taking place right now. Nearly 17 states in this country have some form of voter suppression, and we have to fight it. If we are going to say that voting is a fundamental right and voting is so important, it's just speaking to what you said. We have to fight it nationally. I am huge about local. I understand that, and I'm happy that in Florida we really don't have any voter suppression going on. The ACLU of Florida was able to extend the registration up to 18 or October 18th, which was great. But there's some bad stuff out there nationally. And if we're going to get everyone to recognize it, we have to fight it as a community as a whole. We all have to fight it in Arizona, in Mississippi, in Alabama, because they're requiring people to prove their citizenship in some states. Like, that's absurd. And so I'm sorry, I just had to go back to that point. If you want to fight voter suppression, please, or any kind of voting rights, you can join the ACLU, and the ACLU fights it daily. So I don't mean to plug, but it was burning me up. You're talking about it. Thank you.
And just to, I respect all points, but just to piggyback and push it a little further, I think that one of the most important things that you have to do is get some money. Make some money and put it behind the person, or put it behind the agenda that you want pushed. Because if I'm a person that's on the city council and somebody offers me $50,000, and then y'all have a community arguing and they want something, and I know I'm gonna get paid this on the back end, then guess what? Not me personally, but I'm just speaking on behalf of that, because we've been fighting for jobs and education for 50 years since we got the right to vote. You see what I'm saying? And the issue is still the same today. So we have to be able to make some money, and we are to a point where now we're getting CEO positions. We are to a point now that we are making a little money and we are able to live a little better. So now we have to put money behind our vote, money behind that voice, because this is a capitalist society. And that's one of the the issues that they're talking about federally, is how some of the politicians are funded by big corporations because they put huge amount of money to push their interests. And we have to figure out a way to collectively put money behind our vote to push our interests.
Or take the money out of politics, period.
Right.
Thank you. Environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement, and that's important, meaningful involvement of all people regardless of your race, color, national origin, income, and it's with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental regulations and policies. What we've seen here and what the five-person panel decided on the Flint issue was that this was a clear case of environmental injustice. And this is not only going on in Flint. We've mentioned that it's going on right in our own backyard. Next week, speaking of plugs, next week we will be having a panel on the 25th, Tuesday the 25th at 12 o'clock with respect to environmental justice happening in our own backyard, Apopka. There are farmers being basically poisoned by pesticides. Lupus is running rampant in that community, and it's a serious environmental justice issue that we all should be aware of and be a part of. So I'd like to invite everyone back next week. You can, if you can't make it, you can always tune in via Facebook Live or our podcast, the College of Law podcast. I would love to just give our esteemed panelists a round of applause. This was very informative, very educational, and very meaningful, and I want to extend a special thanks to Brandon for your real input.
Thank you all.
Yes,
Thank you all.
it's really I appreciate it. I had the pleasure of working with Hip Hop for Flint, which was an organization that raised money for bottled water and funding for water filters. So if you guys can find any type of organization that is willing to help and donate supplies, please, by all means, join that. Here at the Environmental Law Society, we're not all just tree huggers. We're people huggers, animal huggers, justice huggers. So don't just discount environmental law because you're not, you don't believe in climate change or whatever the situation is. If you believe in fundamental rights, if you believe in the people, health, come see myself, Travia Smith, Marlon White. Add us on at our twin page, Environmental Law Society, and just thank you all for coming.
Can I just say in closing what I tell my women in the law students all the time? Now that you know better, you got to do better. Okay, you can't unhear what you heard today. And as Macy Gray says, get up, do something. So you do something, no matter how minor you may think it will be. You know better now. You know what's out here and what we're up against, and it's on you. Even if it's as minor as waking your roommate up saying, get your butt up and let's go vote together. Do something. Thank you.